hungry, tired, often dehydrated, yet risking their lives. This is the predicament at least 13.2 million Nigerian children find themselves in every day. These out-of-school children can be found begging for alms, running around the streets of big cities, or on dirt roads in rural Nigeria while their peers receive an education. The COVID-19 pandemic has also exerted its unique consequences. According to UNESCO, over 1.5 billion learners have been affected by school closures in more than 180 countries. In Nigeria, nearly 40 million learners have suffered disruption or an end to education due to school closures. Of this figure, over 91% are primary and secondary school learners. What are the implications of these high figures for Nigeria's development indices in the short to medium term?
The number of children we have out of school now is actually a consequence of the poor quality of education that Nigerians receive over the last few decades. What that meant is that a lot of people have gone through school but have not been able to find a viable economic engagement. And so they're not earning, and when you're not earning, you then have a situation where your kids are out of school or where you are earning poorly. You then find that you're not able to provide education for the children. So there's an element of this is a consequence of some poor educational policies and applications of the past. Projecting forward, if we do nothing about it, what I foresee is a rapid increase in the number of children out of school. But I'm even more worried about people coming out of school and not finding viable engagement. Because without that, without growing employment, then obviously we cannot grow the revenue base of the country, we cannot grow the tax base, we cannot provide public education. So yes, there are some serious implications if we don't have an effective intervention right now.
The problem with basic education in Nigeria is twofold: learner numbers and quality of teaching. In the next 30 years, the number of primary school pupils in Nigeria is expected to grow based on high fertility rates and the cultural value of large families. Studies show that in 2013, Nigeria had a shortage of primary school teachers in excess of 338,000. It is not clear what the latest figures are. By all accounts, from citizens and state actors alike, basic education in Nigeria will benefit from a long-term fix. The questions that therefore spring up are: what should the government do right now to ensure basic education for every child? How do we find more innovative avenues for learning to take place beyond the classroom?
We need to reimagine education and not just continue doing the way it's been done for 100 years or for thousands of years. Right? And Africa has been at its best when it has not followed the status quo. Even if you look at the way the continent has handled COVID, African countries took a different path than the rest of the world, and you can see the results have been better on the continent. And so we need to, and we did the same with mobile phones when we leapfrog. We now need to do the same in education. And so what I was talking about earlier in terms of rethinking education, it's actually less an issue of technology and less an issue of access to data, much more of a mindset. If we are continuing to do things the traditional way, because young people can teach themselves, using even books, right? They can teach each other using books. There's a system in Latin America called the Escuela Nueva system, which from primary school and secondary school leverages self-directed learning and peer-to-peer learning. And they've been doing it for 25 or 30 years, even before the era of the internet, with very high success rates. But it just requires thinking differently and unconventional methods. Africa will never succeed if we follow the conventional path. We need radical, unconventional ways of doing things, and that's the only way we're going to get there. So that's the first place. So it requires political leaders, school leaders, parents, everyone to think differently and to be willing to try new things versus continuing to do the same things over and over. And that is a common problem that every country can, a common way of doing things that can be applied across the whole continent.
I'm very passionate about resolving the primary education challenge. And the reason for that is that is a time bomb that is really going to go off any moment from now. The kids that are in their early teens, if they don't get some education soon, in another 5 years, would be ready for the labor market. My sense is that we do a combination. One is to invest significantly in vocational education, and those investments should be linked to the industries. So for instance, if I want to invest in vocational education for the entertainment industry, I should be having active conversation with those who will employ these children when they graduate. I should have the same thing with, for instance, the health sector. What are the skills that are missing and how can we train for that? The second one is to also deal with the kids that ought to be in primary school. And my thinking about that is that while we try to resource more primary school and put more teachers there, and specifically focus on retraining and training new teachers, that is a must do. We must also look at the alternative of making education more accessible such that they can actually, some of it can be accessed from the home. At the end of the day, what we've learned from the COVID lockdown is that education can be delivered remotely.
The pandemic has forced a new dimension on basic education, with state governments switching to radio and television to deliver their school curricula to pupils. Critics pointed to the socio-economic imbalances that dictate the ownership and usage of these devices. By moving learning to TV, radio, and online, are we simply copying and pasting interventions from the West? In a continent where African users pay nearly 200% more than the global average for mobile voice package prices, how would Nigerian pupils in remote areas or whose parents cannot afford to pay for power and data get an education? How do we ensure that the poor are not left behind?
Nobody should be left behind. In fact, there have been education policies in the UK, in the US, that were fashioned after that. You hear things like no child left behind. So we must first of all believe that is what we seek to achieve. Now, the problems are totally different from place, even urban to rural, like you rightly said. So the solution also has to be so tailored. So if we go to the rural area where there are no bandwidth for them to do online learning, and there is no incentive for the telco to extend those infrastructure to that place, what can we begin to do? We need to encourage the telco. There must be something that will encourage the telco to go there. And those kind of policies will necessarily involve government saying, go there. This is what I will do for you. It might even be a tax incentive. Whatever kind of incentive you want to give to that telco, you will extend it there. And maybe instead of them sitting in their rooms and learning under those conditions, maybe you make available a place where they can gather in open air, and those facilities are provided and they can learn.
The problem is not only with basic or secondary education. In Africa's most populous nation, there are just not enough public university places for those who want to further their education. Across all the educational institutions in Nigeria, 2/3 of about 2 million Nigerian candidates who applied for tertiary education in 2019 were not admitted, according to Joint Admissions and Matriculation Board. Data from the JAM shows that it is not because they did not pass, but because there is not enough capacity. So what do those in charge of education feel about these numbers?
Like we all know that statistics tend to reveal less than they actually explain. That stat is a combined stat. It shows you cumulatively over the period in review how many people applied. None of that statistic has shown you how many are repeat applicants, because every year we take WAEC new candidates on and take new JAM entrants. It's been on the increase for that number of years, year on year. But that does not necessarily mean that you can collapse all of those numbers and get a total average and say only this were taken. But it also points out that yes, there are gaps in the number of people that are going into our institutions every year. Some of them are people who didn't get the courses they wanted the year before. So they might still be in universities and apply. Some people may be offered international relations when they actually wanted to do law. So next year you find them also still applying, and it will look like they are fresh persons, but they are not. We have a cumulative carrying capacity around the universities that are still not taken up, many, oftentimes every year. Our colleges of education, our polytechnics, many of which still do not get full enrollment. We have spaces in private institutions that are also not taken up. So there are quite a myriad of opportunities that are not being taken up.
For those who are able to get a space in these universities, questions remain about the quality of the education they are receiving. According to the 2018 Human Capital Index of the World Bank, 8.2 years of schooling in Nigeria equates to just 4.2 years of learning when adjusted for quality of learning.
Primary challenge that I see with education is that the curriculum are not regularly updated. So the schools are still busy preparing people for the skills of the past. Whereas when they come into the workplace, they find that those skills are no longer useful, and that in fact employers are looking for things that are more futuristic. So if we must make progress, there should be very active collaboration between the Nigerian Universities Commission, the universities themselves, as well as the employers of labor across board. If we do that and they allow us to impute into what they teach and how it is taught, that could make a significant change. The number two problem that we have is that we are teaching a lot of people to remember. We're teaching people to memorize. We're teaching people, in a sense, to regurgitate what they've heard. What we need is to teach people to question, to teach people to be curious, teach people to challenge information, but also to teach people to be able to research and find information. I don't think that that is largely what is being taught in schools, and I think that part of it is because they've not figured out how to measure such skills. So they prefer to measure the skills that are easy to measure. What do you remember? What can you recall? It's a big problem, and I don't see any effort within the academia to rethink how they teach. There is no difference between how students are educated today and how they were educated, I don't know, say 50 years ago or 100 years ago.
The quality of education is also a burning issue at the National Universities Commission, the body responsible for quality assurance of all academic programs offered in Nigerian universities.
Well, the way it is at the moment, of course, we have a curriculum in the system and that prepares students from universities for their various areas of training. And one of the things we are trying to do with respect to the jobs of the future is to also inculcate some of those aspects that will be required to getting them ready for the next, for the jobs of the future into the curriculum now. And that is why we are also at this moment planning a comprehensive curricular review for the Nigerian university system. In fact, if not for the lockdown occasioned by the pandemic, our plan was to conclude the exercise by December last year. But as we all know, when it comes to curriculum review, is the active players of university education, talking about the lecturers that are involved in the curriculum development and review. As a commission, we only coordinate it. And if we had things working according to our plan, and there was no break during some part of last year, by December, like I mentioned, we'll have concluded it. What we expect is, from this exercise, is a better curriculum in the sense that it will be a multi-stakeholder based curriculum. I mean, there is no way anywhere in the world we are going to develop a curriculum for a higher education institution and you are not considering the end users of the product, talking about the employers of labor.
As Nigeria works on quality and delivery of content relevant to the 21st century, budgetary funding is another hurdle on the horizon. education allocation is between 15 to 20% of the budgets in developing countries. In Nigeria, funding for education has remained historically low at 5.6%. Will things change in the immediate to long term?
Really, Nigeria must keep investing, but it must invest within the limits of what it has and the capacity to absorb it. So the investment profile for the country is on the increase. We're expanding. We've just released 40 billion for end allowances in universities. We're expanding assets. 212 billion is being provided by TED Fund. All kinds of incentives are being offered to lecturers and people and students to make education and learning and its outcome relatively workable for our country.
The experts think the government can do better.
Nigeria is the biggest economy in Africa in terms of GDP, followed closely by South Africa. Now, the education budget of South Africa calls it learning and culture, is an equivalent of about 10 trillion naira per annum. So that is about the size of our entire budget in Nigeria. So where do you want to begin to cut and dice that? So we're far away, very far. If I want to benchmark South Africa, then the education budget of Nigeria per annum should be about 40 trillion naira. There's still a whole lot of wastages within government. So we need to begin to ask ourselves if we can mop up some of this wastages and divert it to places like education. That's on the government side. And government itself needs to begin to think differently about education. If another African country is already spending 10 trillion per annum on education, and I'm in the same global community, what would be the fate of my own people 10 years or 20 years down the line, vis-a-vis those other people that are investing massively in the education of their people? So when we begin to think along that line, maybe we will start to appropriate a little bit more to education. Another side is the corruption side of things. So even the little that gets to education, a chunk of it still get diverted. We had a recent situation in which ICPC was saying some money voted for feeding of, I think, federal government colleges has ended up in some private accounts. So even the little that is being made available by government, a chunk of it is getting stolen.
In order to be competitive, we have to rethink Nigeria's entire education model. Across the continent, this perspective is gaining ground.
One of the biggest opportunities that I see is for us to leapfrog education systems by building the education of the future in Africa. And that can come by really rethinking who's responsible for learning. You see, because traditionally education was done in an era where information was scarce. So you had to go to a university or a school to get it from the head of the professor from the library book. But today we live in a world where information is ubiquitous, and a child in a rural area in Africa today can access more information on their mobile phone than someone who was doing a PhD at Oxford or Harvard 30 years ago, because we didn't have this information. So what we need to do is to really create an education system that is not dependent on a scarce resource of teachers and professors, but one that is based on abundance, which is a system built on around young people themselves, where they can teach each other with all the content that is now available, where they can teach, where they can learn by themselves. Because peer-to-peer learning and self-directed learning can be very powerful. And then you mix that with some interaction with those few teachers that are very qualified that you have. And I think with that, we can then rapidly scale up education and also keep it very high quality and allow us to, in just one generation, in 10, 20 years, massively see a population that is better educated and that can actually drive the innovation and creativity and job and entrepreneurship that this continent needs.
with a young population of about 50% whose mean age is 18 and a half, an unemployment rate of 27.1%, and a growing restiveness which has led to increasing social unrest. It is clear that more radical ideas are needed to overhaul education, and urgently too. Failure to do so will turn the advantage of having a sizable youth population into a problem. The government seems to understand this danger.
It's a chicken and egg situation. One gives birth to the other. If you do not have appropriate education, you may end up being a fodder for those who are going to try to cause economic or social mishaps. Whereas if there are no social mishaps and if there's insecurity, then you don't get the education. But I'm sure in the next week or so, thereabout, you will hear about the rollout from the Ministry of Humanitarian Affairs, because this has been addressed with what the President calls the alternate school program. Because we've looked at all the schools we have nationwide. We've examined their constraints. We've seen that there are gaps in how our school system reacts. In other words, we found out that of the 115,000 primary schools in Nigeria, if you're not enrolled in any of them, you are regarded as an out-of-school child. Now, this excludes people who are getting all kinds of education. So really, there are alternate forms of learning. Some of them are Quranic, some of them are Islamia, some of them are apprentices in their shops, in their Oga places, in their different marketplaces, and so on and so forth. So federal government is going to roll out a nationwide scheme on all across this 774 local governments across the country to identify where there are gaps in children being accommodated in formal education, and where those gaps exist, to then institute a way of delivering formal knowledge to them without necessarily dragging them away from where they're at into a formal standpoint. In other words, making sure that the education gets to the child instead of waiting for the child to come to the education. Your point is well noted. We know that gaps in education breeds grounds for insecurity, and the existence of insecurity in itself breeds ground that ensures that education is not delivered properly, because insecurity is a problem in delivering education around the country.
Experts believe there is a way.
First and foremost would be political will. Second would be commitment to long-term changes. And third would be that we limit the impact of politics on governance. There are tough decisions that we probably need to be made. One of the things that could help, which is like a live wire, is we need to shrink the number of ministries, departments, and agencies. We have 600 or more. And there have been reports and white papers suggesting that if we have a leaner, trimmer government, and if we're able to reduce the cost of governance as well as plug the leakages, then there are resources that can go into these areas. I think the private sector can come in to take care of an area where there appears to be a gap, and that's in career development. If we're able to set up structures to help young people to have the kind of mindsets that are positive, that would lead them to develop skills and to be able to understand where their talents are, we would have done something, because we do that in the work environment, helping people to understand where they need to go and how we can get value from them. So if we are able to bring that into the academic space while we work on curriculum in partnership, and while we also embark on joint research projects to address the problems, those are areas where we can come in. The first and foremost is we've got to stop being adversarial. So we point fingers at the people in the tertiary education sector and say they are not producing graduates that we want. And it's true, they are not producing the quality of graduates we want. And they look at us as outsiders and say these people don't understand what we do. We've got to break those barriers and begin to build relationships of trust. And we also have to work to understanding the situations and the nuances even better, because I had mentioned earlier that there's always a problem of the single story where we have a narrative and that's what we stick with, whereas there are multiple dimensions that we should take into consideration.
Whatever Nigeria's solutions to education, it is crucial that inclusion is achieved and that every Nigerian child has access to quality education irrespective of their socio-economic background.